Hello there, sword friends. Today I have two examples of the Hanwei Orchid Katana that I'm going to share with you. Before I do, there are some disclaimers, some caveats, some considerations that you need to hear before you hear anything else out of my mouth. First and foremost, I am not an expert in Japanese swordsmanship, the Japanese sword, or any of the like. This review is going to contain my thoughts, my opinions, my criticisms and critiques, but they're really just my thoughts. So keep that in mind as you hear me talk. And I suppose that just keep that at the back of your mind. Take what I say with a grain of salt. Two, these are both secondhand examples, and that means that they're not necessarily representative of what you would expect to get if you were to buy one new from CAS Iberia or an authorized distributor. I think they're pretty representative. That's why I'm sharing them with you. But nevertheless, that is a variable that should be in your consideration, or at least you should know about it. Lastly, I am not paid to do this review. I bought these with my own money. I got a good deal on them. They're secondhand, as I noted, but I'm not being paid to do the review. I'm not affiliated with CAS Iberia. I spent my own money on these secondhand samples, and that's really all I have to share in terms of disclaimer. So on with the review part. The first thing I'm going to talk about is this website. So note that it is a $1,300 sword, though on Cult of Athena it's around $850. And so I am thinking about it from the lens of an $850 sword rather than $1,300 because an authorized reseller that sells new products sells them for $850-ish, at least as of late September 2018. The Orchid Katana is a beautiful, relatively light blade with a KC-120. So this KC-120C powder steel, I found it to be durable in some cases, though a little bit more bendy. Those are my personal observations. It's a really solid steel, and it does a good job. Hanwei seems to be the only one that advertises swords made out of this steel, and I don't exactly know why. In any case, it holds an edge well, and it seems to stay straight reasonably well, but it's not a terribly forgiving steel, at least as it compared to their T10 and other like practical or through-hardened blades. The hada is prominent. That is pretty true. The ray skin is a high quality. I would find that to be true on one of the swords rather than both of them, though I will share that with you later. The ito is supposed to be cotton, and it feels like silk in both cases to me, so maybe I just don't know what cotton feels like, but it's supposed to be cotton. I would have guessed it was silk. The tsuba is a blackened iron with an orchid and butterfly decoration inlaid in silver and brass and copper. This is interesting because the tsuba is magnetic. I can show you that later when I talk about the tsuba, though the inlay, it doesn't certainly seem like it is a clad or a plating or an etch. It seems like an inlay, but it's I don't know, very machine made at the same time. I will talk about the fittings, though I would say overall I do like them. The saya is a lacquered buffalo horn, and that is true. The fuchi, yada yada yada, bronze disc, etc., etc. Then there's some measurements. I will share with you both the measurements of the katanas that I have in the description down below. I would say that this is kind of an average almost of the swords that I have. It is certainly not reflective of either sword I have, but it is close to both of them, if you will, which is good or bad. To me, these measurements are very important, specifically if I'm talking about a light or heavy blade. This kind of falls in the lighter category, and if you're looking for a really light blade, you want these statistics to be accurate because presumably some people that are looking for this sword are particularly fascinated or enamored or otherwise really desiring a blade that is of a lighter quality. And while this certainly falls in that category, you know, some of these measurements are not terribly accurate. One is heavier, one is lighter, one is thicker, one is smaller, etc. And I will show those to you in a minute. So let's get into the review. Let's talk about the kashra, the end point, the bit of this fitting. So I have some magnets here, and what you can see is that the kashra is magnetic, the tsuba is magnetic, as is the fuchi. So these are presumably made of some sort of material that is magnetic. So it says that it's iron. I have no reason to not believe that. Now, these particular fittings from Hanwei, the kashra, the fuchi, the tsuba, realistically, as well as this kojiri right here, are really distinct in comparison to other Hanwei fittings. They have this kind of shiny shibuichi type of looking patina to them, which is really, well, frankly, I like it a lot. It's classy, it's simple, it's blingy, it has a lot of characteristics that one could really like. And they do seem inlaid, though I don't necessarily know if they're inlaid in the conventional sense or if there's like some sort of molten brass that's poured over it. They do a good job of consistency between the fittings as I compare the two swords, but nevertheless, these fittings are a different type of class than I typically see in Hanwei fittings. Pretty unique in the distribution that Hanwei has, and something that I really don't see in a lot of models that they do. There's not a bad transition between the two, though it does bunch up slightly. And on the newer Hanwei model, it seems to be reasonably tight. The end knot isn't bad, though there are some fraying bits around the end here. And the kashira just seems to have this kind of weird nub end to it, as though it's not necessarily finished or shaped properly, though I still like the shape, so it fills me with a bit of controversy. For what they are, I just enjoy them quite a bit. Now, as we move on to the ska, the first thing to note about the ska is that it is small in comparison to other Hanwei products. Hanweis typically have this sense of being an axe handle shape, and if I showcase it next to the Oni katana, you can see just how much smaller this ito, or rather ska, this handle is in comparison to what is a more conventional Hanwei axe handle stereotypical shape. It's much smaller, much more refined, fits in my hand, and even though I have these large sausage hands, this is still a much more comfortable shape for me to grip than the conventional Hanwei ska. The ito itself, in both of these examples, are very tight, and I've had Hanwei ito which is quite loose, but in both of these cases, I would suppose that it's not as tight as it could be, but overall it feels really quite tight and quite well done. The difference is underneath. One of these has much better samegawa than the other. The older iteration has little itty-bitty nodules, and the newer iteration, I believe this is newer, has a larger samegawa panel which has some larger nodes and is of a higher quality. Presumably those strips and panels are of a higher quality. In any case, the ito has diamonds that are misshaped and not necessarily perfectly done, but the overall shape of the ito, the tightness of the ito are good. Perfect diamonds is something that would be nice to have, but isn't something that I've really seen nailed in inexpensive swords. And the $850 certainly not inexpensive, but I haven't seen that really well executed in a sword, even at $850. As we move on to the fuchi, as I noted, it's magnetic. It has the same flowing theme to the rest of the fittings. The transition here seems to line up reasonably well. I'm not noticing on either one of them some gaps in the panels. A lot of times the samegawa panel will shrink, or it's not fitted on properly, and this fuchi, this area right here, is where we will often see a large gap, and you can see the wood underneath. I don't see that here, so that's a good sign, and it has a classy look to it. As we move on to the tsuba, well, I talked a little bit about it. It's magnetic, and it has some inlay, and it says it's silver, and it looks really nice. There's not really much else to say. It shows fingerprints, I suppose, pretty easily. It has this kind of mirror finish to it, but overall, really classy delivery of a tsuba. I have to say, I like it quite a bit. If we talk about the habaki, well, this one is polished and the other one is not. It's the standard Hanwei brass habaki. You've seen it in probably a few other reviews. It's a one-piece habaki made from Hanwei without a lot of frills. It's perfectly fine. It does the job, and both of these examples seem to hold in, well, not necessarily super well. This one holds in well, as where this one will fall out with some ease. So I don't know exactly what to say about that. Given that they're both secondhand, I don't know how well they were treated, though the habaki seems to fit really well in the newer one, so presumably it will if you buy one. Let's talk about the saya. It says it's a lacquered blue, and that is the case. It is indeed a lacquered blue saya. It has a horn koiguchi in this area, horn kurigata with some shitadome, if I'm saying that correctly in here, and they don't seem to be loose or popping out, which is a notable thing, because a lot of times when they put these little washer decorative pieces in the kurigata, this place that holds the sageo, it immediately comes loose. They pop out and then they scratch the saya. These have not come loose in either case, though. This one does not have a sageo, but you can see that the shitadome are firmly placed inside here and have not fallen out. The sayas are gloss and show fingerprints, certainly, and they also both have this kind of phallic tip here, which, you know, honestly, I like, not just because I'm enamored with dicks, but because they have a similar theme to the rest of the sword, but both of them kind of toe in a little bit here, and it gives it this mushroom-headed look, which it just gives me an endless supply of dick jokes, and it's you know, it is what it is, but I do have to say I like the attempt here. It's classy, it's different, it's good, but at the same time, I would like it if it was inlaid or set in a little bit more so it didn't didn't kind of toe in. I would like it if the transitions here were a little bit better. In both cases, they seem to have this similar transition where it's just a tip that's glued on as opposed to set in, which would be preferable. Now we can talk about the blade, the pointy stabby part, but before we talk about the part that's sharp, let's talk about the part that's not, the nakago. And this is what I want to show you. The nakago on these Hanwei pieces have a little bit of character to them, which is quite a bit different than many of the other pieces. Now, not every piece from Hanwei has character and style the same way this piece does, though many Hanwei pieces do have the same sort of file markings and signature on them, which is really unique and interesting to the mass production market. Now, a lot of times people don't disassemble their swords to clean them. They don't ever take them apart, and thus many manufacturers just don't. Well, that's an assumption on my part, a speculation, but many manufacturers don't put a lot of energy into how these nakago look. So when you take the sword apart, it really looks quite bland, or it has a signature on it that doesn't have the same type of really attention to detail that Hanwei does. Now, is Hanwei the same as an antique sword? No. The antique pieces look quite a bit better, but it still makes an attempt at it. And if you were examining a sword and you were to look at this nakago, it would give you the impression that someone at least paid attention to a very minute detail that someone might not see, and it gives you some sort of faith that somebody paid attention to the rest of it, the other parts that are really important that you can't see until you're in the thick of it and you need the sword to do what it's supposed to do. In any case, the nakago looks good. So in both examples, the nakago looks good. It has file markings, it has a signature, and I really like this attention to detail from Hanwei. I think it's well worth it and something I appreciate. On to the sharp, pointy, stabby part. So the blade mentions that the hara is bold and the hamon is pronounced. That's the case. This is Hanwei's Swedish powder steel, and it has this frosty, unique hamon from Hanwei. It stands out. It doesn't let you necessarily see a lot of the detail in it. The hara stands out as very bold, but the hamon is really obscured by this frosty pattern on it. And underneath this hamon, this frosty exterior, is a genuine hamon, though you can't really see it because it's frosted. Hanwei does their own unique thing in this way. It's pretty symptomatic of their KC-120 folded steel blades. The hara is reasonably pronounced. The hamon is visible, but it's visible in any light, but you don't really see a lot of the metallurgical effects that you might appreciate in a hamon. In any case, it certainly aesthetically looks good. And from a blade standpoint, the Orchid is unique. The handle is more refined and small, and so is the blade. Both of these examples are small in comparison. It reminds me of a more antique Nihonto piece where it's thick and tapers down to less than an inch at the tip, and it almost looks, if I compare it to a little rapier here, you can almost see that it's certainly bigger than a rapier, but at the same time it's not as big. If I compare it to the Oni katana, you can see the thickness difference in the tip. It's much smaller, and as a blade, this is one that like you almost feel comfortable with one-handed. It's nimble, it's agile, it's small. In terms of what you would move around, this is comfortable to use as an iaito, to move around and do thousands of repetitions with. This is the ideal choice. Now, the Shinto might be actually the more ideal choice, also a light blade, but oftentimes comes with a bohi. But I prefer this Orchid katana. The fittings, the folded steel offer some aesthetic choices that aesthetically I find more appealing, and in terms of moving, it's just a really enjoyable experience. Now, I've actually got both of the swords kind of dialed up in the Weapon Dynamics computer. I'm going to show you both of them, but I'm going to include links in the description down below so that you can see them. They are different, and if I compare the two swords, there are some differences by about 2 ounces in weight, and one of them has a more pronounced curvature to it. Well, really more of a pronounced curvature throughout the blade. And one of them seems to have almost Saki-Sori or Tori-Sori, but at least kind of towards the tip a little bit. This one, the older piece, is a little bit straighter, doesn't have as much of a curve. This one, the curve flows really throughout the blade. It's a very interesting piece to hold two of these swords. If I hold them in my hand, they do feel like two different swords, but they're at least in the same ballpark. I suppose that brings me on to the usability side, and as I move it around, this is a sword that is super comfortable to use for iaito, for kata, for doing multiple repetitive movements. You know, if you're gonna swing the sword around and do hundreds of iterations or hundreds of practice sessions, this is a great shinken, I think, to start with for the purposes of iaito. It's comfortable for me to use and doing kind of one-handed kata. It's comfortable to swing. It's a very comfortable sword. I really enjoy actually swinging this sword around. In terms of cutting, it's light, but it's also marginally thicker. So it has a slightly thicker than average kind of base, and it stays a little thicker towards the tip. So while it is smaller and more refined and lighter weight, it keeps some of its rigidity through its thickness. And I really didn't have a lot of problems cutting with it. It wasn't necessarily bad to cut with. Now, I'm a big guy, but this is a small sword, and as I flung the sword out there, it seemed to do a reasonably good job in terms of cutting tatami mats. Was it the best cutter? Certainly no. Would I bring it to a competitive session of tatami cutting, or would I compete with it? No. But does it do the job if you want to do some tatami cutting, but your primary obligation is to do kata? Yeah, it does the job. It can cut, and that, I suppose, is appreciated. It does the job. It's not limited in terms of its small scale size, and it doesn't prevent it from being a reasonable cutter. Are there better cutters out there? Absolutely, and I would certainly say that this is like 70% a kata blade, or a blade that moves and is agile, and I would prefer to use this if I were fencing, but it does cut tatami, so if you need to move all the way through a target, it's certainly possible to do. It's not excluded from that, but it's certainly not its strength. And I suppose that's the interesting thing. This is a very nimble blade. It favors maneuverability, and it's something I really appreciate. It is a fun sword to move around. It's elegant and classy looking, and it follows suit with the maneuverability and ability to kind of just put the point exactly where you need it to go to cut, and just not be fatigued by maneuvering the blade. I really enjoy this piece. So that brings me to the question, do I think this sword is worth it or not? And the short answer probably isn't going to surprise you. Yes, $850 is a lot of money, but this offers something unique in the realm of Hanwei pieces, which I think is unique and interesting and cool, and that is that it is a lightweight sword. It kind of favors, in my mind, personally, it's like a 70% Iaito kata, but done with a shenkin, with a sharp sword, and a 30% cutter. Now, it cuts, it does the job, it's light, it's maneuverable, it's durable, it's functional, it does what it's supposed to do as a cutter. It doesn't bend. I wouldn't necessarily take it to bamboo. That wouldn't, in terms of hard cutting, it wouldn't be my first choice, but I wouldn't necessarily avoid it either. The main point is that it can cut, though in terms of maneuvering and doing something with thousands of repetitions, most of the swords out there are overbuilt, they're thick, they're clunky, they don't necessarily give me the impression that I would want to move them around for thousands of repetitions, that it would be easy and functional and cool, and yeah, in this case, yes, it's light and maneuverable and functional. I can move it with one hand. I can do one-handed kata. It doesn't tire me out. So if I'm doing a seminar, if I'm learning kata, this is a great thing to learn kata with the shenkin, and that's honestly a rarity. There are not a ton of swords that are light and functional and good, and also have the same aesthetic appeal as this one does. So I like the fittings, I like the assembly, everything does what it's supposed to do, it's sharp, it's good. Yeah, I think it's worth $850. Now, the trick is that if you're looking for a competition cutter, this would not be it. As I noted, it does cut. It's not something I would necessarily really choose to cut bamboo with, or harder targets, but I wouldn't necessarily avoid it either. It seems functional enough to do that, but at the same time, it's really not a competitive cutter. If you were going to war, that might be one thing, but if you're trying to do competitive tamashigiri, then this would not be my first choice. There are other swords that are better suited to that task, but if you're trying to do kata, if you're trying to periodically cut, but most of your stuff is really spent, most of your time is really spent doing kata, doing Iaido, then this is maybe a better choice for you. And personally, I do cut stuff, obviously, you've seen my videos, but I spend a lot of time doing Iaido. I spend a lot of time practicing drawing and putting the sword away, and something like this is a lot more comfortable to do thousands of repetitions with. So as a tool for a martial artist, it is really appealing. And as an aesthetic thing, granted it doesn't have demon faces and all that kind of stuff, but it's elegant and simple and small and nimble, and it's very fun to hold. So there's really a lot going well for this sword. I really enjoy it quite a bit, and those are my thoughts. I think it's an awesome sword. It's one of my favorite swords from Hanwei. The Oni still stands out as the coolest demon face stuff. The Shinto has dragons and is the kind of conventional idea of what I think of a samurai sword when I think of a reproduction samurai sword with dragons and that type of thing. And the Orchid is right in there as well. And in my top 3, I really enjoy the Hanwei Orchid Katana, one of my absolute favorite swords. And that is all I have for you. Hopefully what I've shared has done something for you. That's all I've got for you. As always, cheers and thanks for watching.